Hello, everyone. We are in the third week of Module 4 on Europe and North America from 1900 to 1950. I'm putting up our overview and our module objectives here again, just as a refresher. And this week is focusing, you'll notice that the reading for this week in the textbook is quite short, but I think that this week is very crucial to understanding this first half of the 20th century. It would be hard to imagine a history course on this geographic region in this time period that would not have a substantial discussion of Nazi society, Italian fascism, Stalinist Soviet Union. So why is it so hard for art historians to imagine a course on modern European art that would involve more than just a kind of cursory reference to art and totalitarianism? Why do you think Nazi art is so often excluded? Think about the art we've already seen in this module. Part of the problem is that art historians see National Socialist or Nazi art and architecture as an exception, a side issue. It distracts us from the dominant stream of the 20th century avant-garde. And many would say, well, this art is not actually art, it's propaganda. It's the cultural production of the losing side of World War II. But this exclusion from the narrative of modern art reveals some basic and fallible assumptions about modernity and modernism. We assume that all art under a dictatorship looks the same and all art under a democracy looks the same. But there are many examples that confound those assumptions. I mean, here I have two paintings for us, one painted in a democratic United States, one painted under a totalitarian regime, under the Nazi regime of Germany. Can we tell what painting is done by a Nazi artist? I mean, if we look at the left here, this is done by Grant Wood, the same guy who did American Gothic. And on the right, we see the Nazi German landscape painter Werner Peiner. I mean, why do we learn about Grant Wood but not Werner Peiner in the history of modern art? And so these are the core questions. This is really the main kind of inspiration for our study this week. I want to give a little bit of background for Hitler's rise to power, because as you know, sometimes in just brief overviews, people will talk about how, well, Hitler came to power through democratic means, and that is absolutely true. What we see over a series of elections from 1930 to 1933 is that the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party, slowly gains more and more seats in the Reichstag, which is the German parliament. And with more and more seats, then Hitler rises to the position of chancellor. The president of Germany, Hindenburg, did this not because he sided with the Nazis, but because he wanted to kind of control them. He wanted to keep tabs on them. But then what happens is Hindenburg dies and Hitler says, oh, well, I can be chancellor and president at the same time. And so we see the Nazis slowly centralizing power. And art policy became a very important element of, very important actions that dominated their 12-year rule. What we're looking at here is a protest piece against Hitler by a German artist who began in the Dada movement. His name is John Hartfield, and this work, we see the title down here, it's called Adolf, the Superman, swallows gold and speaks junk. And Hartfield used the technique of photo montage to create these composite images that served as political critiques. And so we see that he spliced negatives together of Hitler giving a speech in his military uniform, in his fascist uniform, with an X-ray, and then all of this gold. And here the message is Hartfield wants people to see that Hitler, when he speaks, he talks about he's kind of gives the typical fascist message that he's for the people, he wants to help the people. But what Hitler was really about was he took money. He took a lot of money from big corporations, big industries that financed his rise to power. And he was really working for the very powerful and the very wealthy. And Hartfield wants us to see that contradiction in Hitler's message. So if we get back to art policy here, one of the first things that Hitler did in office was commission the construction of an art museum. This is the House of German Art in Munich. And I should say today, the House of German Art still stands. It is a museum dedicated to the art that Hitler abhorred, of the modern avant-garde and now contemporary art. And if you think back to Ai Weiwei's backpack installation that he did on the side of a German art museum, it was this building. So now we're coming full circle to understand the very different circumstances of construction here for this building. So Hitler, he was an art school flunky, loved art and architecture, and Troost was his favorite architect. He had been a party member since the very early days, since the early 20s, but he dies suddenly in 1934, and so Hitler actually actively supervises this project in the early years of the Third Reich. He really did imagine himself as an architect of the Reich, as an architect of the empire. The limestone was cut by hand from German quarries. It was important in Nazi building to use local stone. Construction actually forbid the use of heavy machinery. There was no mass production used here that might displace workers. However, hand labor is really intensive. And so what actually happened to stay on track is that more and more forced labor from the early concentration camp was used to build this building. And I should say the only reason this building survived is because it is so huge and massive. Look at the size of those cut stones. And so during aerial bombing of Munich, it survived. And later leaders decided, it has survived. Let's leave it as a cultural institution to the art that the Nazis fought against. There is a reference here to classical antiquity a little bit. We see all of these, kind of Doric-styled columns. This portico here with the colonnade on the front. Why did the Nazis use this model of classical antiquity? They saw ancient Rome and the Roman Empire as a kind of role model, the cradle of European civilization and of Western rationality. They wanted this image of timelessness too, the idea that they were seeking to create a lasting empire just as the Romans did. Now, this building held an annual exhibition that became kind of like the Salon, the major showcase for Nazi-approved art. And this exhibition was called the Great German Art Exhibition. What we're looking at here are photographs on the right. We're looking at the cover of the catalog here on the left, and then in the center is an example of one of the paintings that was shown here. And This um, this exhibition was attended by Nazi elites. Here we see Hitler with his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, very powerful in art policy as well. And I think that this catalog really shows us what the aim here was, because we see again this kind of classical aesthetic at the front, where we have the head of Athena, classical, but also kind of modern, kind of streamlined, more modern use of line here, in strict profile, wearing her helmet. Remember, Athena is the goddess of culture and the arts, but she is also the goddess of war. And of course, in 1937, the Nazi government was already remilitarizing. They were already preparing to instigate World War I in World War II, in 1939. We see that Athena towers above a German eagle that is spread out here, holding an oak leaf wreath with a swastika in the center, all emblems of the Nazi state. We won't be reading the speech that Hitler mentions for the Great German Art Exhibition, but what I do want to mention here is that there was a counter exhibition held each year at the same time that was called the Degenerate Art Show. And we're looking at the interior of that here and then its catalog here. And I encourage you to compare these two catalog covers. What we see is the name Degenerate Art Exhibition Guide. Art is scrawled in crayon in this kind of childlike writing, and it's also in quotation marks to say, this isn't really art. In fact, this show was held in an empty warehouse. It wasn't held in an art museum. And you can see works by Kandinsky, Dada artists. Here is an avant-garde sculptor whose work, The New Man, is shown on the cover. This is exactly the type of modernist work that the Nazis sought to attack. And we will speak more about the exodus of the European avant-garde as they left Germany, and then later as Nazis occupied more of Europe, they left France, and many of them came to the United States.